In the summer of 2023, the Mississippi River fell to one of the lowest stages ever measured at Baton Rouge. For the second year running, drought pulled the water back far enough to expose ground that had not felt open air in decades. Along the bluffs south of St. Francisville, in West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, the retreating river left behind a stretch of packed clay and cypress stump that a parish maintenance crew had never had reason to walk before. Clearing a drainage cut below the bluff line, the crew found brick. Not scattered brick, not rubble, a run of steps, 6 of them still standing in sequence, rising out of the mud at a level, consistent pitch, bound with a lime mortar that stopped being mixed that way in the region more than a century ago. The steps did something that made the crew stop clearing silt and start taking photographs instead. They did not face the river, they climbed away from it, up toward the tree line behind them, as though whoever built them meant to walk out of the Mississippi and into the forest, not down into the current. That is the line that has followed the Bayou Sara steps ever since. They go the wrong way. It is worth being exact about what that phrase means before anything else, because it has already outrun the evidence, the way these phrases do. It does not mean the steps make no sense. It means they no longer point at the thing they were built to reach. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the crew found, once the parish called in a survey team from the State Historic Preservation Office, was a staircase built from fired clay brick, the kind produced in local kilns through most of the 1800s, each brick roughly 8 inches long and holding the reddish, slightly uneven color of hand-molded clay, rather than the uniform tone of a modern extruded block. The mortar binding them was lime and river sand, soft enough that a fingernail could scratch a groove into it, a mixture common before Portland cement became standard in the region toward the end of the 19th century. 6 steps survived intact, each roughly 14 inches deep and 7 inches high, a rise and run consistent with staircases built for foot and cart traffic between a landing and a bluff top. A 7th step was broken, its brick face sheared away, and below the 6th step the surveyors found no more structure at all, only a shelf of packed clay that had once, they concluded, been the surface of the batture, the strip of low ground between the river's ordinary channel and the base of the bluff. Near the foot of the buried run, the crew also recovered a corroded iron ring, roughly 4 inches across, of the kind blacksmiths forged through the 19th century for tying off a rope or a small skiff, still seated in a socket of brick that had been built to hold it rather than punched through later. The tread of the 2nd and 3rd steps, the ones that would have taken the heaviest daily foot traffic between a working landing and the bluff above, showed a shallow, rounded wear pattern down their centers, the kind that accumulates only after years of boots crossing the same 6 inches of brick, and not the sharp, even edges a step keeps when it is laid and never walked. The orientation was measured twice, once by hand compass and once by GPS, because nobody wanted to publish a claim they would have to retract. Both measurements agreed. The staircase climbs from what was once the batture up toward the bluff, and its foot, the lowest surviving step, points not toward the river's current channel, but toward a stand of oak and hackberry more than 400 feet from the water's edge today. The survey team went a step further and laid the staircase's bearing over an 1860 landowner's plat held at the parish courthouse, one of the few surviving maps drawn while Bayou Sara was still a working town. On that plat, the river's edge sits almost exactly where the modern tree line now stands, close enough that the surveyors could draw a straight line from the staircase's foot to a wharf marked on the old map, without the line bending at all. A staircase built to bring people up from a landing does not, on its own, look wrong facing trees. What makes the Bayou Sara steps strange is what should be on the other side of them and is not. There is no landing there now. There is no dock, no pier, no channel deep enough to float a barge, nothing but forest floor and the kind of undergrowth that takes over ground once it stops being cleared. The steps rise from nowhere and arrive at nowhere, and for a few weeks in the autumn of 2023, that fact was treated, understandably, as a mystery with no obvious door out of it. The door out of it is the town the steps belong to, and the town's own record explains more than the staircase alone ever could. Bayou Sara was charted in the late 1700s on a stretch of riverbank below the bluff at St. Francisville, and by the middle of the 1800s it had grown into one of the busiest steamboat landings on the lower Mississippi, a cotton port serving the plantations of West Feliciana Parish, with warehouses, hotels, a newspaper, and a wharf that could see a dozen boats tied up at once during the shipping season. In a good year, cotton moved off the bluff and down those brick steps by the bale, stacked on the batture to wait for the next boat north or south, and the town's merchants kept tonnage ledgers that survive today in the parish courthouse records, an ordinary paper trail describing a thriving river economy rather than anything held back from view. The town burned more than once, in fires that took whole blocks of its waterfront, in the 1850s and again later in the century, and it flooded more than once too, most severely in 1893, when high water tore through the lower streets and left much of the town uninhabitable. At its height in the 1850s, boats bound between New Orleans and Memphis or Vicksburg made Bayou Sara a regular stop, loading cotton and unloading everything a plantation economy could not grow or manufacture for itself. And the wharf saw enough traffic that a resident standing on the bluff at dusk could often count 3 or 4 steamboats waiting their turn to tie up. Rebuilding after 1893 went slower than rebuilding after the earlier fires, in part because the merchants doing it could already see what the fires alone had never threatened. The channel in front of their wharves was narrower than it had been 10 years earlier, and shoaling where there had once been open water. But fire and flood are not what finally erased Bayou Sara. The river did that on its own schedule, by moving. The Mississippi does not hold its channel the way a canal does. It meanders, cutting into one bank while depositing sediment on the other. And over decades that process can shift the entire riverbed hundreds of feet, sometimes more, without any single flood or storm being responsible. On the outside of a bend, the current runs fast enough to carve away the bank a little further with every high water season. On the inside of the same bend, the current slows and drops the sand and silt it is carrying, building a point bar that grows outward, year on year, until dry ground stands where a channel used to run. Left alone long enough, a bend can loop back on itself entirely, and the river will cut straight across the neck of the loop rather than follow it, stranding the old curve as a crescent lake and leaving whatever stood on its outer bank facing water that no longer exists. The definitive record of this behavior for the lower Mississippi is a set of maps published in 1944 by Harold Fiske, a geologist working for the United States Army Corps of Engineers, who reconstructed the river's historical channels going back centuries using aerial photography, old surveys, and soil cores pulled from the floodplain itself. Fiske's maps show, in the stretch of river running past St. Francisville and Bayou Sara, a channel that has swung measurably westward over the period the town existed, cutting away at ground on the far side, while building new point bar, new batture, directly in front of what had been the town's own wharves. The town's wharves did not sink. The river simply stopped arriving at them, one growing sandbar at a time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By the early 1900s, what remained of Bayou Sara was a scattering of buildings on ground the river no longer reached in any useful way, and the town's population and commerce had shifted up the bluff to St. Francisville itself, which still exists today. Bayou Sara does not. Its post office closed. Its wharves rotted. Its streets went back to cane and timber, and within a generation the exact footprint of the old port became a matter of local memory rather than surveyed record. The staircase the 2023 drought exposed was not built to face the wrong way. It was built to face a river that, according to Fiske's own reconstructions, used to run roughly where the trees now stand. The steps have not moved an inch since the day the last mason set the final brick. The river moved instead, and it took the reason for the staircase with it, leaving 6 steps climbing patiently toward a landing that has not existed for more than 100 years. Bayou Sara is not the only town on this river that the current has treated this way, and putting it beside its nearest counterparts is the only way to see the pattern instead of a single strange staircase. A little more than 200 miles upriver on the Mississippi side of the channel sat the town of Rodney, once a serious rival to Natchez for river commerce, home to churches, a bank, and a population in the thousands during its 1850s peak. Rodney's decline began not with fire or flood, but with a single flood season in the 1860s, when the river's main channel shifted roughly 2 miles to the west, stranding the town's landing on what became a shallow, often dry bayou, rather than the navigable Mississippi itself. Boats stopped calling, commerce moved to towns the river still reached, and within a decade the merchants who had built Rodney's brick storefronts and its 2-story bank were gone along with them. By the early 1900s, Rodney was a fraction of its former size, and today it survives as a scattering of ruins and a handful of residents, more than a mile from the river that built it, its old wharf road running out into farmland instead of water. A church there still stands with a cannonball lodged in its wall from a wartime engagement fought when the town sat directly on the Mississippi's bank, a physical marker of exactly how far the water has since retreated. Further north, in Arkansas, the town of Napoleon met a related fate through the opposite mechanism. Founded at the confluence of the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers, Napoleon grew through the middle of the 19th century into a substantial port, notable enough that Mark Twain, describing his own river journeys in a book published in 1883, wrote of passing the site and finding that the town he remembered from his youth as a riverboat pilot was simply gone. Twain did not describe Napoleon as stranded above a retreating channel, as happened at Rodney and Bayou Sara. He described it as consumed, the river cutting directly through the ground the town stood on until streets, buildings, and eventually most of the original town site had been carried downstream a piece at a time. Where Rodney and Bayou Sara were abandoned because the water left, Napoleon was erased because the water arrived where it had never been before. Both outcomes share a cause. The river moves, and the towns built to serve it do not. And over a long enough stretch of decades, the mismatch between a fixed staircase and a wandering channel becomes a piece of physical evidence that looks, to anyone who does not know the river's history, like a mistake in the original construction. None of this required the builders of the Bayou Sara steps to have done anything unusual. They built toward the water they had, the way every landing on this stretch of river was built, oriented to a channel that was, at the time, a permanent enough feature of daily life that nobody thought to record exactly where its edge sat in relation to the bluff behind it. It is the river's own long memory, kept not in a courthouse ledger, but in sediment layers and channel scars that a geologist can still read, that explains what a resident walking the Bachur in 2023 could not have known on sight. The steps were never wrong. The map around them changed. There is an older and stranger version of this same relationship between people and this river's shifting ground, and it sits less than 100 miles from Bayou Sara. At Watson Brake, in Washita Parish, 11 earthen mounds connected by low ridges form a rough oval nearly a quarter-mile across, built by hunter-gatherer communities with no agriculture, no metal tools, and, as far as the record shows, no permanent settlements of the kind that later mound-building cultures would establish. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed such large-scale earthworks required farming societies capable of feeding a workforce through a single planting cycle, and dated complex mound construction in North America accordingly, placing it no earlier than roughly 3,000 years before the present. In 1997, Joe Saunders, an archaeologist then affiliated with the University of Louisiana at Monroe, published radiocarbon results from Watson Brake that pushed that date back by more than 1,000 years, to roughly 5,400 years before the present, making it, at the time, the oldest known mound complex in North America. The people who built it were feeding themselves entirely from wild plants and river fish, moving camp with the seasons rather than staying in one place year-round, and they still organized labor precisely enough to raise and align 11 mounds around a shared geometric plan, a feat that had, until Saunders published his results, been considered impossible for a society without stored surplus grain to feed a settled workforce. Not far south, at Poverty Point, A related culture built on a scale that dwarfs Watson Break several centuries later, 6 concentric earthen ridges opening onto the Bayou Macon, laid out with a consistency that modern surveys confirm down to a matter of feet, across a site covering more than 300 acres. Like the Ohio earthworks built by the later Hopewell culture, Poverty Point was raised entirely from soil moved in baskets, without draft animals, without a written record, and without, as far as any recovered artifact shows, the surveying instruments that would make such precision straightforward. The people of the lower Mississippi Valley were shaping this ground, deliberately and at enormous scale, thousands of years before Bayou Sara's first mason ever laid a brick step toward a landing that the river would later abandon. What connects a 19th century steamboat stair to a 5,000-year-old earthwork is not mystery in the sense of the unexplained. It is the same river, doing on a scale of centuries what it has always done on a scale of millennia, rearranging the ground that people build their lives against, and leaving behind structures that only make sense once you know where the water used to be. The mounds at Watson Break and Poverty Point survived because they sit on ground the river's channel migrations never reached directly, high enough and far enough back from the active floodplain to escape the fate of Bayou Sara and Rodney. The steamboat towns were not so fortunate, built as they had to be right at the water's edge, in the one zone this river guarantees it will eventually move through or away from. The 6 brick steps below St. Francisville are still there, cleared now of most of the silt that hid them, climbing out of a shelf of old mature clay toward a stand of trees that most visitors assume has always stood exactly where it stands today. It has not. For most of the life of the staircase beneath it, that ground was open water, and boats loaded with cotton tied up close enough for a deckhand to step directly onto the bottom brick. The river that built the reason for those steps is the same river that erased it, moving west by a few feet some years, and by a few hundred feet in others, indifferent to which bank held a wharf and which held forest. It will keep doing that long after every remaining brick has weathered back into the clay it was fired from, long after the current drought breaks and the water climbs back up over the Bature and buries the steps again the way it has buried them for most of the last century. The staircase is not proof that something was built wrong. It is proof that the river was never going to stay where anyone expected it to, and that the ground beneath a Louisiana bayou remembers exactly how far the water has traveled, even after the water itself has long since moved on. Someone will find those 6 steps again, in another dry year decades from now, and stand at the bottom of them looking up at trees where a landing used to be, and wonder, for a little while, which way the builders thought they were facing. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.